Again, welcome, and let's go ahead and get started. We're happy to be joined by our colleague from the Department of History, Dr. Brad Hunt. And so without any further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. And I also want to thank Meredith here in the room, who's our AV guru. Thank you both. Thanks for this invitation to talk to Curl. I'm losing my voice a little bit. I have the last of my green tea. You may have to consume some more of that to be heard, but I'm really looking forward to telling you about my work with the National Public Housing Museum and to explain that project and why I think it's important for academics, scholars to also be engaged in the public with their work in spaces like museums. It's been a big week for the National Public Housing Museum. I'm going to show you a lot of slides today of what we're doing, but this has been an especially momentous week because on Tuesday we broke ground for the renovation of the building in the back of this slide. This is the board and some other dignitaries, some aldermen, the mayor, Lori Lightfoot's there in the middle. This was a great day. It was sunny. It was beautiful. It was just really moving for me because I've been working on this project for over 15 years. I started working with the National Public Housing Museum in 2007. I joined the board in 2008. This is most of the board, not all of the board. About a quarter of them are current public housing residents. Almost another half, another 50% are alumni of public housing or currently working in public housing. And about a quarter are allies from a spectrum of corporate to academia. I'm in that last group. I was here. You'll see me hiding in the back there behind the mayor. I'm standing to my left is Cornelius Griffin, I believe his last name is. He's the contractor who's going to do the renovation. He's an alum of Cabrini Green. To his left is the alderman of the region. In the front row next to the mayor is Sonny Fisher. To the mayor's right, Sonny Fisher is our board chair. To her right is the chair of the Chicago Housing Authority. I mean, this was really an example of our allies who have worked over a long period of time to get us to this point. Our fearless leader, executive director, Lisa Young Lee, you're going to hear me talk a lot about her and her vision and her work. She spoke, and I want to tell you about the transitions over time as the museum has evolved, and she has been a significant part of that. But there are leaders here like Francine Washington, also a board member, grew up in Stateway Gardens, is the president of the former Stateway Gardens, which has since been torn down. Francine Washington, a fearless advocate for residents, and her presence on the board and the presence of other residents has been central to the work that the museum does. Let me back up just a little bit, tell you where I'm coming from. I have been writing about public housing off and on for quite a while. I did an oral history book in 2005 titled When Public Housing Was Paradise. That with the work with a gentleman named Jim First, who had been a Chicago Housing Authority staff member. I helped edit that collection, and then I did a monograph called Blueprint for Disaster, The Unraveling of Chicago Public Housing. That really tells the decline, the rise and fall story. I also worked on a book called Planning Chicago. 2014 includes a chapter about the plan for transformation of the CHA. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to assume the audience knows something, but I will just touch briefly. In any event, I'm coming at this as a policy historian, as a longtime policy guy. And in these books, I've learned that, it's easy for the state, for government to build housing. It's difficult for the state to build community. That's a different set of problems. So I consider myself something of a reformed social scientist, I still have a strong interest in the history of structural racism, segregation, redlining, homelessness, inequity, lending inequity, affordability issues. But now, because of the museum, and this is why I advocate faculty to get outside and connect yourself to a cultural institution, I have learned to become more of a humanist. Community, words like empathy, housing as a human right, thinking about concepts of home. These are not things I was doing when I was writing the policy histories that I've done. And we have to do both aspects, the policy history and the humanist themes in this museum, because we need to draw people in with an empathetic experience that they can relate to, but we also need to explain to them the structural racism that resulted and that caused many of these outcomes, and the politics that prevents us from embracing a more activist state, particularly in the housing sector. And you know what's interesting is we don't have a museum or cultural institution anywhere in America that confronts housing as a human right, and public housing in particular. We have all sorts of museums nearby the National Public Housing Museum. There's the National Hellenic Museum. Up here, there's the Swedish American Museum. We have amazing museums in this town for the sciences and for the high arts. That's great. Why not a museum about the national struggles for housing and for home? And why can't that museum be more than just didactic? Let me teach you about what happened in the past. Why can't it actively work towards the goals that it talks about on its walls? In this case, in our agenda at the National Public Housing Museum, housing as a human right. So let me give you an outline here of where we're going. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the museum, the history of the Jane Addams homes, where we're cited, our early vision and struggles, this creative programming that we've undertaken before this groundbreaking. Remember, we've been at this 15 years. What have we been doing? And the leadership involved. And now we're getting to the finish line. And now we're facing really challenging questions about what's going to be on the walls and how are we going to live this mission and continue to be the activist museum that we want to be. Okay, so that's the agenda. First, our site. Oh no, before I do that, sorry, I got to show you this. There's a big question here. This is the cover story on the Chicago Reader. Quote, who the hell is going to go to a public housing museum, end quote. And this is a challenge that the museum has faced from its start. There's been a lot of resistance to the idea of a museum to what many perceive to be a policy failure. And certainly there were failures, and we're never going to sugarcoat that and ignore that, but we really want to get that this is one of the challenges that we face. Why would I do that? And I think it's only through that creative programming and the humanistic approach and getting people to start with some empathy that you can get there. If all we did was policy, and I'm a policy guy, if all we did was a curl mode, lots of good charts and graphs and stuff, no, we would not be able to get people to go to a public housing museum. But the title there gets to the cultural dissonance around public housing in this country, the way it's tarred, the way it's viewed as a racialized, gendered poverty space, and why would you celebrate that? And let's unpack some of that. But first, let me tell you about our space. This is the building that we are going to occupy. It's actually an L-shaped building. This is the last, U-shaped building. So you're only seeing really 1/3 of it. This is the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes. This image was taken in 2004. You can see it had been abandoned by then. No one lived in it in this state, but it was abandoned around, this building from around 1999. And 5 years of entropy, of being exposed to the elements, had already taken its toll. The Jane Addams homes, for those who are relatively new to Chicago, is on the near west side, not far from UIC. This is what the complex looked like when it was opened 1938, 960 units in low-rise 3-story buildings. The National Public Housing Museum structure is right there. So it's, the arrow points to it, it's just one building among many in the complex. It's the only surviving one. The rest of this space has all been cleared and some of it rebuilt already with the Chicago Housing Authority's plan for transformation. The courtyard in the Jane Addams homes, it was a progressive set of planning and architecture that went into this. There were animal courts. There was a real effort to think, beyond just housing in the 1940s into what it would take to create spaces for youth and children. And I think that's part of what also is driving us as a museum. When it opened, as the title of that oral history I did, people loved it. They thought it was paradise, many coming out of slum conditions, moving into modern kitchens, modern appliances for 1940, separate bedrooms, multiple bedrooms. The early days, people were thrilled with it. It was added on to. New additional developments were created nearby, the Robert Brooks homes and Loomis Courts in 1942, which does survive to this day, and the Grace Abbott homes, high-rise buildings later. So by this period between 1938 and 1955, you had a very large complex, 3,600 units. By the 1950s, Jane Addams homes had transitioned from largely white to almost entirely African-American. The Brooks homes was opened intentionally for African-American residents, ditto for the Grace Abbott homes, labeled on this map as Adams Brooks Extension. They hadn't come up with a name yet when this map was created in 1952. And Loomis homes. So this was a racialized space in the middle of an Italian-American neighborhood. To the south was more African-American. To the south today is Pilsen. To the west today is some of the medical complex of UIC. To the east is more of UIC and the little Italian, Little Italy neighborhood of Chicago. So Adams started out racially integrated, but in a very cautious way. A handful of buildings were racially integrated, but over time, the pressures of racial transition meant that the Jane Addams homes became all African-American. Again, there's our building. That's where we sit. You can imagine this as part of a large complex of 3,600 apartments, 15,000 people roughly. The Robert, these buildings decayed for very complex reasons. You can read my book, Blueprint for Disaster. I don't want to burden this talk with too much about the decline. It certainly has to do with funding, structural racism, the increasing poverty due to racial transition, and the tenant policies that it made public housing very attractive for low-income families. And just the general neglect of the city as well. This building, the Robert Brooks homes on the left, beautiful when it opened. By 1998, it really is a mess. It has partially been renovated and saved. But for the most part, public housing in Chicago, as we know, first became a police state. Here's the Robert Taylor homes. We see the police cars in front, and then it was demolished over a period between, say, about 1996 to about 2005, replaced in a neoliberal model with mixed income housing. This slide foregrounds the new version, which draws on new urbanist concepts and architecture, reversion in essence to the old urbanism, and behind it, the former high rises of the Henry Horner homes. This was a traumatic period in Chicago's history as residents were moved out, given vouchers, or not if you didn't have a right lease, and shipped to other neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods that had to absorb the populations with all sorts of challenges, particularly around gang violence. The neoliberal model remains to this day, the assumption being that concentrated poverty is bad and that architectural styles matter. So these are mixed income properties, meaning a mix of of how a mix of incomes among the families who are renting. Okay, so that's the CHA. Oh, and thank you, David. Here comes David with some water for me. He can see I was struggling.
Water there,
Already.
green tea there.
Oh, excellent. More green tea. I'm already out. Thank you, David. You're very thoughtful. So this is the context in which the National Public Housing Museum is starting to brew among residents. And when the residents of the Jane Addams homes of that larger complex, ABLA, we called it, said, we were here. We want to be remembered for being here. We don't want to be torn down and have everybody erase us. It's an erasure question. And in public history, and in history generally, we're very much focused, historians are very much focused these days on the concept of erasure. And so when Ms. Devera Beverly on the left here, who was a CHA commissioner, the president of the ABLA homes, that big 3,600 unit conglomeration, including the Jane Addams homes, when she said, we want a museum to the CHA in the late 1990s, they went, what? We didn't know what she didn't know what to do, but they didn't know what to do. But Ms. Devera Beverly was persistent and tenacious. She was like the mayor of ABLA. She was powerfully politically. She controlled votes. In another world, she would be a mayor in a community. She absolutely was sharp as a tack, knew how to get things done, extremely talented individual, and really was a dynamic individual. She connected with Sonny Fisher, who was at the time the executive director of the Richard Driehaus Foundation. Sonny Fisher grew up in public housing in the Bronx, and the two of them bonded. And the two of them hit it off, and Devera Beverly passed away. A good question, 2010, I want to say. But we continue that vision. And she, as Devera put it, we want to leave something so our children or grandchildren will know we were here, that we were here. So place, space, those are meaningful concepts to public housing residents. If you've had your house torn down, if you've been let your community labeled in a certain way, that place and space takes on a different resonance than it does for those of us who may move apartments freely by our own choice. When you've had your community demolished, that's a different situation. So this is around 2006, 2004, 5, 6. This idea is brewing. People are getting together. Meetings are being held. The Chicago Housing Authority agrees to not demolish that last building as a potential space for a museum. In 2007, they commissioned a feasibility planning study. That study says, let me back up. In 2006, the residents of the CHA's local advisory councils, that's the Democratic body that expresses, or the Republican body, I guess you would say, a representative body of the residents, signed a resolution saying we want a national public housing museum here in Chicago. Now, let me back up a little bit about this national question. First, Devera Beverly thought museum to ABLA, museum to my community. And then she thought, well, it's going to have to be a little bigger than that. She thought museum to Chicago public housing. It was only in conversations over time with Sonny Fisher from the Bronx and convinced her that a national museum would be essential for drawing enough interest, enough funding, et cetera, that would be a way to go. At one point, I arrived in 2007 and said, why don't we do international public housing museum? There's a lot of stories all around the world. We ought to, yeah, okay, at some level, we've scaled it back and it's a national museum. And one of the challenges of the museum has been to be a national organization. We brought on people to the board who are from around the country. We're trying to partner around with other cities. But I think one weakness, to be honest, is that it has been rather Chicago-centric. But anyway, back to this feasibility report, it said, yes, you can do this. Yes, there's a market. It estimated 56,000 residents would want to, 56,000 visitors a year would attend. It suggested a $1.5 million operating budget with 1/3 of that earned revenue. This was all very comparable to other museums. It also suggested museums to look at as models, including the Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute in Alabama. These were large, these are today are large, newly built institutions. We were renovating a public housing building that created a little complication, but the real model that both the early advocates for the museum and this feasibility study pointed out is the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City. If you've never been to this museum, highly recommend it. It's an outstanding institution, really a pioneer in public history, in telling stories through recreating the apartments of an old tenement building with a true mission around serving immigrants. And that has been their current activism, and it's what makes them what we call a museum of conscience. And in fact, Ruth Abram, the woman who was the founding Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, the founders of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in the late 1980s. They found this building. They found the money to buy it. When they got in there, it was a mess. They left one apartment as a mess to show to visitors what they found and what the transformation was as they recreated apartments from various periods in American history and told the stories of immigrants from the 1840s, the 1870s, the 1890s, the 1900s, 1920s, 1980s, as Chinese immigrants moved into the Lower East Side. So not only did Ruth Abram found this, well, let me talk a little more about the museum. They have actors serve as docents. So when you go to this museum, you buy a ticket for a tour, an actor, actress will take you into an apartment and be an immigrant from Russia in 1910. And someone will ask, where's the, where's the telephone or something? What's it? They will, questions that are ahistorical will be met with puzzlement, is a way to frame it. But they very much inhabit the stories of the people of the time. And it's just really innovative and lots of great studies on it. Ruth Abram here also founded the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And this was a way to expand their reach, the method of creating a museum that not only told the story of immigrants, but that also did programming for current immigrants. They were running English language classes, citizenship classes. How do we be immigration law seminars? They are actively participating in the theme that they have in their museum. And this international coalition brought together multiple museums, including a District 6 museum in Cape Town, South Africa, that tells the story of how Black South Africans were, their community was wiped away in an urban renewal in order to make space for whites, or a space like the Maison des Esclaves in Senegal, Africa, which is where enslaved peoples were brought on their transit across, before their transit across the Atlantic, to really capture a sense of not just talk about enslavement in the past, but also the ongoing enslavements of peoples around the world, which continues today. It's a 200-year-old slave house that helps spark action for the estimated 40 million people still enslaved today. Okay, so this is the context, again, in which the National Public Housing Museum came up with its vision statement in 2008. And I want to wrestle a bit with how this evolved over time. We immediately thought we wanted to be a museum of conscience, but there were reluctance on some on the board to advocate strongly for housing as a human right, in part because, well, is that going to turn off donors? Instead, we had this vision of preserving, recovering, revealing, community building in the face of adversity. It's a story about resilience. It's a story that's an uplifting one about the people who struggled but were still there, or struggled and made it. Part of the early work of the museum in 2008 is to highlight individuals who ended up doing tremendous things. This was part of the residents' vision. They wanted to talk about people who made it, and they wanted to highlight positive stories. They were tired of public housing as a negative story. This, collection of individuals, everything from Jimmy Carter. This is, as Lisa Lee called it, the did you know phase. Did you know that Jimmy Carter grew up in public housing? Did you know that most residents of public housing are in fact white in this country and not black? Like if you include senior housing and the broad affordable housing mix, those are really true statements. You got everybody from Rick Scott, the right-wing governor of senator from Florida, to Jimmy Carter, to Barbara Streisand, to Lloyd Blankenfein down there below, who was the head of Goldman Sachs. This was also a fundraising strategy, as you can imagine, to hit up wealthy people who were alums of public housing, if you will, including entertainers, financiers, athletes, people in prominent positions. So that had its weaknesses, and it didn't really have, in my mind, as a board member by now, it didn't have the oomph that it really needed. And we started to do more programming at this point. Before I get to the programming, we started to think about the building and the renovation, I think, a little too soon. Interestingly, the 15 years we've had to gestate, if you will, has helped us really refine the mission and vision of the museum. Here's the building. Here's an architectural rendering. In 2007, we were ready to go. Somebody was going to drop $15 million on us, and we were going to be ready. This rendering feels awfully dated. To put a screen on the front of the museum that would almost hide the building in a way. I thought this didn't quite appeal to me, but we had Land and Bone Baker Architects. They've done a lot of affordable housing in Chicago, really skilled, and over time they've evolved their strategies, and that's to their credit. We hired our first executive director not till 2009, so that you can imagine, like, we were still struggling to generate the operating income to do things. And Keith McGee was a charismatic Harvard Divinity graduate, could give, he still has a tremendous preacher's intonation, and he was an evangelist for the museum. We did start getting some grants to do stuff. We started doing what we called Museum in the Streets. We were trying to raise the big money, looking for an angel donor. But in the meantime, we wanted to get the museum's mission out and start to refine it. We did an exhibit in the Merchandise Mart, Coming Home, that started to tell some of the big themes. That was in 2010. By 2015, we actually started to clean up enough of the building. This is an inside shot of the Jane Addams Homes first floor apartments to install some lights. I actually installed those lights in that image. That actually got up there, and I had a generator and a bunch of extension cords. Anyway, we took the units, the apartments, as in their condition. We swept them out. Boy, it was a mess. You can imagine 10 years of entropy, and then installed an exhibit. And this was for the first architectural biennial. We did other exhibits where we would project things on the walls that were very rough after years of exposure to the elements. The paint had peeled, the walls had started to crumble. And this was all good work. But it still lacked, it was telling resident stories that was positive, but it still lacked a strong message around, that oomph that I think it needed. And that oomph finally came with Lisa Lee, who came to us from the Hull House Museum. She is on the faculty in museum studies at UIC. Here we have another charismatic, dynamic leader who really upped our game in a way. I want to read something that Lisa Lee wrote in spring of 2017 even before she took on the museum as executive director. She had been on the board since 2008, had been a forceful advocate for a more aggressive stance in terms of the activism of the museum. And by the time we got to 2017, I can say it was a pretty low point. There were many of us who thought this isn't going to happen. We cannot raise the money. Our message was not resonating with the African-American community, with wealthy African-Americans, excuse me, who we thought would be donors. Like, why would I support a museum that is a monument to unwed mothers? We got that once. There was a racialized, genderized take on the museum, and it did not feel like a positive. We had the positive energy, and to her credit, she was like, no, it's here, and we've just got to tell it. Let me read what she wrote at one point. The National Public Housing Museum seeks to gather and present powerful stories that probe the systemic causes of poverty, acknowledge everyday struggles, advocate for social justice, illuminate the complexity and diversity of public housing residents, and celebrate their resilience and creativity and the joys of making a home in public housing. Okay, there's a lot there, but there's this joy, but also resilience and struggle, systemic causes, social justice, and she's really integrating these two themes of activism and resilience in a way that we hadn't done before. And then she addressed a big theme that we had been doing. We had been saying we tell stories. Public Housing Museum tells the stories of public housing. She then says stories can create important sites of resistance. Stories are important. Stories are at the nexus of the personal and the political. But focusing too much on the personal, too much on stories, can lead to myopia, an inability to see how larger structures of the economy and the state impact the realm of the individual and the family. Focusing too much, focusing too much on structures can lead to a neglect of the agency of the people who create policy and the specificity of influence on individuals. So there's this balance. You've got to do both the stories and you got to do the structure. We might imagine this, the National Public Housing Museum can be a space that bridges the gap between the personal and larger public policy. We might imagine the space as the social or the commons. The social is a place where connections are forged across lines of difference, of resistance, and struggle. It is the sphere in which claims against the political order are made in the name of justice. The museum as a commons is more than resistance against a response to the forces of privatization, not just resisting the neoliberal project. It is the space where we, through arts and culture, a lot of arts and culture here, forge connections across difference to join the struggle for justice. At the National Public Housing Museum, we ally ourselves with the radical dream of public housing and its potential to create deep-rooted communities, common history, and public good. A lot of themes there. And that last one, public good, I'm going to come back to at the end. So she really drove the board and drove the museum to really get more active. Housing is a human right, social constructive. This is 2017 exhibit. In 2018, she goes back to the stories, history lessons, everyday objects from Chicago public housing. These are community curated, meaning work with residents on the objects that meant something to them. Get the stories of the objects, in this case, a baking dish that seems unimportant, but Deborah Smith, this is a dish where she made rice pudding and bread pudding and was with her mother, and this is her memory, that these memories and stories matter, and that the objects can become ways to get other audiences to empathize. Now, does this work with everybody? Some people are like, that's a baking dish, why do I care? No, I mean, that when you connect it with the story of the residents, it does start to humanize these residents who previously had been thought of as the other. Some, some of these objects were fabulous. This was Marion Stamps was a leader at Cabrini Green. She was also a member of a motorcycle club called the Raiders of Chicago, even though she did not own a motorcycle. But she was an active participant. They acknowledged that the residents had lives, had communities, had their own forms of community that may not appeal to middle class sensibilities, but that are nonetheless need to be preserved and recovered. So she's alternating between those strong policy, strong structural policy questions and the stories. A lot of our oral history work began, really upped our oral history game, and really we ended up hiring a full-time oral historian. That's pretty rare for a small startup museum. Continued though also on these themes in programming with the policy stuff. Land trusts. The Public Housing Museum did a major virtual teach-in around land trusts and their ability to help change the narrative around private housing structures. 36 questions for civic love was a way to start a dialogue in small groups around what does the public mean, civic engagement, to get people to think about how the public is all around them in new ways. And she called it civic love. Lisa Lee loves the word love. Every email she writes will be love Lisa. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I mean, it starts to get, yeah, you get on board. Another one on gentrification, hired an artist we hired an artist as instigator with a grant. This is Tanika Johnson, who talked about inequity for sale, about contract buying in the past and how that has devastated communities. These are well beyond the public housing as the HUD and a narrow version of public housing into a housing policy writ large. Also went into youth programming, taught them how to do oral history, got a grant to do that. We now have an entrepreneurship hub and worker cooperative, which models some of the older public housing worker cooperatives that existed. They make things now. This is all part of this super creative programming that energizes foundations and corporations. I can tell you that that the amount of grant money that she has raised through these initiatives, which then gives an entree to going back to them for capital gifts for the museum. It has been a successful fundraising strategy. If we're doing things, we can't give that creative idea, give donors a sense of the creativity that will come out of this museum, and that it's not going to be a set of static things on the wall. So that's a bunch of this program. We called it Museums in the Streets. That has taken a lot of time and energy for the museum, but has been successful, I would argue. Still left the problem of what to do with this structure. We were getting complaints from residents nearby who were like, when are you gonna build this thing? Or let's tear it down. There was a sense from the local community, mostly the gentrifying white neighbors, that this was a blight. And it took a whole lot of skill on the part of the board to keep the Chicago Housing Authority on board. That's where the residents on the board were crucial. Their activism to say, no, do not back out of this, CHA. We, the residents, want this. And also to keep on board HUD and other organizations that were going to be important in the final museum. We started to clean up the exterior and use the space on the exterior for the activism. This is from 2020, right before the election of 2020, a rather political message. It's fearless. You can say, are we too political? And there were board members, I thought this was a little out there, like, oh boy, this could backfire. But no, it really said to important donors and others that we are an activist museum, and this is who we are. It created the energy to help us raise the $15 million we needed to renovate. So we created our capital campaign in 2019, preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to have a place they can live and prosper, a place to call home. We had a new logo, a little rebranding, and the centrality of place. The National Public Housing Museum is the only cultural institution in the United States devoted to telling the story of public housing. Preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper. So blending again the human right, home, cultural ideas, as well as this policy history. So let me walk you through some of the exhibits. I know we're getting a little long on time. I'm at the 40-minute mark. We're going to, just like the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, renovate a few apartments and tell the stories of those families. There is a play here around race, because the Jane Addams homes started out as a largely white community. We want to remind white communities, who will be a major audience for this museum, that public housing is not a Black institution. That it has, that the majority of people who live in public housing or in affordable housing in HUD programs are white in this country, and that there was a history here that was positive for families like the Mador family. Their grandson is on our board, gave us this material, and we are able to recreate the apartment because of that research. We have objects from the family, but we can also add context around their lives as a Jewish family in Chicago, in an Italian-American community at the time. We have images of them in the Jane Addams homes. And it's going to be able to recreate their world and give that, create that interface that will create the empathy of a visitor visiting, like, yeah, this could be me, this could be my relatives, this is a part of my story. We also have the Marshall Hatch family. Marshall Hatch grew up in public housing. He's on our board. He's a minister today. Another charismatic figure. His family, from his experience, this was about the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the social activism of that period. He had pictures of Martin Luther King on the walls as a family. They turned the TV to that, to those civil rights moments that were on the television. We have objects, we have photographs of the Hatch family and can tell their story writ large. There's Marshall Hatch on the left. It's 1969. His sister to Marshall's right said, "We thought TV was MLK TV," meaning that's when their parents turned it on whenever there was a civil rights story. And so this is part of their story, part of this story we're going to tell with these images. There's also going to be this apartment as we found it. We're calling it Poetic Ruin. It's going to be swept, obviously, and cleaned, but the chipped paint and the tile floors and the medicine cabinets and the buzzer speakers and the numbers and things like that, all these images will remind us also of the policy neglect here. We cannot forget for a second that this story of neglect, of structural racism that drove public housing into the ground by the 1990s is vital part of the story. And the paint chips become this metaphor. I'm going to come back to that in a second, for both decay, but also remembrance. And the artists do these really amazing things with it. I'll show you that in a minute. We're going to have public housing residents do a lot of this docent work in the museum. There was the Chicago Tenant Patrol. We're now going to do cultural workforce training of former public housing residents and current public housing residents. The Tenant Patrol was a fixture in public housing. There's a thought, well, we'll get the blue jackets back, and that can be the uniform of the docents There's a lot of creative work being done on this by the residents themselves, who are very eager to tell their stories and be authentic figures in the museum in an ongoing basis, so that there's direct connection where visitors interact with current public housing residents in a way that they might otherwise never do in their lifetimes. Okay, back to the paint. The paint was green. We did a whole there's a lead paint problem, but we've figured out that that's a major part of the renovation. We're going to make sure there's no lead dust in the air. But this green paint appears in the photographs, and it ties to social justice issues around lead paint, right? I mean, this is it's public housing is not, there are many issues around housing, including the lead paint crisis, that we can talk about in this museum as another way to get at social justice issues. That was a big issue for Barack Obama, who got his start, of course, at Altgeld Gardens, a public housing development on Chicago's South Side. We preserved this green paint and put it in a blue site, but it becomes the inspiration for the entrance to the museum by two artists, Amanda Williams and Olakan Jaifus, who are designing the entrance where this screen will have all those colors of various paint chips in a kind of a collage. It looked beautiful in some of the renderings. Of course, Amanda Williams is now a MacArthur Fellow, but did amazing work for the biennial around painting abandoned houses in Chicago, bright colors, and then taking photographs to kind of off-center the idea of, to both highlight the abandonment and rethink the use of color. It's more sophisticated than that. That's where the artist, the social scientist in me isn't good enough. But they take those paint chips, and here's the rendering of what might be on the outside of the building. And it really creates this colorful collage that suggests multi-ethnic, multicultural communities, but also decay, but also rebirth. I mean, it's really, I think, creative. I'm not, enough of an artist. I got a few more slides here, though, folks. Let's talk about the design development. What's going to be on the walls? I think this is still a challenge for the museum. We still have walls. Great with the programming, great with the stuff that's going to happen when the experiences you're going to have. But how do we tell a policy story? This is Curl. Like, if we're going to do, we're in Curl, the Center for Urban Research and Learning. How do we tell the story, a policy story? I was like, this, we can't be too boring. We're in this design development phase for the walls. How do you tell a policy story? Boy, it's hard. I sometimes, and this is the policy story to me, says, don't worry about the 1937 Housing Act. But the 1937 Housing Act, we're going to try to put it on the wall because it says that, the policy of the United States is to eliminate unsafe and insanitary housing, eradicate slums, provide decent, safe, and sanitary dwellings for families of low income. It's as close as we've ever gotten in this country to housing as a human right. We're a long way from that. Certainly not where we're at. We don't have healthcare as a human right. There are many things where we don't have human rights in this country, including housing. So the 1937 Housing Act, how do you make this visually compelling? How do you tell this story? We've convened not only museum professionals, but also scholars. This is ongoing work. This is a mock-up of that July meeting. And we'll talk about segregation. But we'll also try to relate to space. We'll talk about the services that were offered in public housing, social services then and now, but we'll also talk about schools. How this all appears on the wall. That's where you get museum professionals who know more than I do. We're going to tell the story of redlining, though. There's going to be policy stories that we think will resonate, but also the objects that will tell that human story, and those apartments that will really dig into those families. I think some of this has still got work to do. Do you want to put a plan of the whole complex? Maybe, I don't know. And there are others who say, the residents say this, and the residents are going to win on this, which is the right thing. I didn't mean win like they beat some of the policy folks. No. But they want to talk about the music of public housing, and there's going to be a room dedicated to the music of public housing that will connect the music, civil rights, the communities in interesting ways, and that will humanize as well. Is this getting far afield? Maybe a little, but there are messages around housing in a lot of this music. We're going to restore the animal sculptures. That's work's already underway through some major grants. There's an example of a restoration, and we're going to put those in the courtyard behind the museum, in that courtyard of the U-shaped space. And there's a rendering of that. How are we paying for all this? Here's our sources of funding for 15 million. We're still a couple $100,000 short. Please get out your checkbooks. The state is the various state and governments, the Chicago Housing Authority, City of Chicago, State of Illinois, 55%. That adds up to 55, 52, 50, a little, almost 55% if you include the National Endowment for the Arts. Foundations, 18%, corporations, 6%, donors, individual donors, 21%. I gotta say, there's an irony here that COVID has been incredibly helpful. The City of Chicago money and the State of Illinois money is all part of that large amount that was distributed to states in the first rounds of COVID and in the second rounds in the Trump administration and the early Biden administration. Without that, we don't make it. That's all 48% of our money. So yeah, I don't know how we're going to think about that. One more slide, then questions. Thank you all. This is reminding us that this is about place. That by, oh, I should add one more thing, that we're going to have 15 units of affordable housing on the one wing of the museum. That brought in additional money to stabilize the roof. So 14 million is not the actual true cost of this whole renovation. And with tax credits and preservation credits and other things, we're able to have a portion of the building living the mission by providing affordable housing. And with that, I've talked too much. I'm going to stop. I'll just say, you know, that this public, one more thing, that public housing cannot be siloed from other publics. And I think the more we talk about publics as we think about the human rights, that we can resonate with broader audiences. It's about changing this tune of the last 40 years of privatization, neoliberalism, to advocate for a more active role for the state in thinking about housing and home as a human right, and that museums can and should be more than museums of just experience. It can be activist entities that not only create empathy through this contact and experience, but also thoughtfully advocate on the issues for which they stand. So I'll stop there. Thank you. A little long.
No, perfect. So, thanks so much, Brad. I'm going to have you stop sharing your screen there if you can.
I know how to do that.
Or I can end it for you.
Please end it for me. Somehow it's not.
There you go. And then just say, first of all, thanks. Fascinating presentation. I was fortunate enough to be on some of the early conversations very much on the margins, and it's good to get an update. And particularly this week, I would love to say that we planned it that way at Curl, that we invited you in this week when the announcement was made earlier.
I got lucky.
Yeah, exactly. That's just good dumb luck. But there's a fascinating conversation going on in the chat about to use the building or not use the building. Is that necessary, not necessary? So I'm going to have Ted and Tim and Maggie. Any one of you want to give voice to what you've written in the chat?
Yeah, sure. I'll just there's an old saying. I work with the Chicago Maritime Museum, and the way they ever talk about physical structures is like boats are holes in the water where all your money goes. And while I'm not against historic preservation, since I teach that class in our program, early on in your discussions, was there ever a thought to let's have a place to tell the public housing story, but let's not take on the really long-term costs of maintaining a deteriorating historical structure? Because it's a huge startup cost for you guys, bigger than you'd otherwise have.
Yeah.
But think about what that's going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now as that building deteriorates further. So that was my point. And
Yeah, there was a
other
conversation.
individuals.
Yeah, there was absolutely a conversation to do a storefront, just rent space and put up exhibits. The thought was that the residents didn't like that idea because it was one more erasure. And they really wanted that because most of the rest of their communities are gone. And that by having this historic building, it would add to the draw. But yeah, there was a lot of talk as we were running out of money and barely making payroll around 2015, like, okay, let's just get a storefront and rent it for $10,000 a month and figure it out, I think the real compromise that was essential was the idea to build, to take a third of the building and turn it into public housing units. That created a lot of capital, and the CHA, for instance, paid to stabilize the whole roof, and it will be renovated in part with their money. And so that opened up new avenues for financing and historic preservation tax credits that we could sell to corporations and things like that. So that's a little beyond, I don't know all the details on that. But yes, it was absolutely part of the conversation.
I think at one point during your talk, I sort of got the impression that it might still be possible to go a different direction. But then as you were wrapping things up and you mentioned the public housing component of it, I definitely got the impression that that's a firm commitment by everybody on your board, up and down throughout the chain. So that point of contingency has passed.
Well, it was controversial to say we're going to put housing in there. Oh, we don't want to be a landlord. What if we may need that space in the future? Eventually it got to the point where we needed the money, but also that to live the vision, and that there was a lot of people who said you should renovate that whole thing and it should be public housing. There you could house 50 families if you the museum got out of the building and renovate that as public housing. We don't need a museum, we need more housing. And our argument's been, we're not going to change the dynamics around affordable housing policy and around housing as a human right if there's not a institution out there actively doing this work. Well, you can do that in a storefront. We just felt that we needed a anchor, a place to do that.
I just want to add one more thing, and then I'll stop and mute myself. I know that area well. I walk by it almost every day, courtesy of my job. And that area is gentrifying. And over time, you're going to deal with a very present contrast between what you're doing and what's happening in the area. For instance, I noted in the chat, there's a gorgeous new CPL building that went up right next to that. And I think it's Mother Cabrini Hospital that was on north of the grounds is now another nice set of condos. And I see dogs out on the field, people out there, it is not what it was, and it's never going to be that again. And I think that's going to be a living contrast that you're going to have to deal with going forward.
You're exactly right. There's still a lot of vacant land next to the museum, and eventually the CHA wants to develop that as mixed income housing. But as we've seen over and over again, they keep reneging on that promise. They're going to take a bunch of the ABLA land, and they just gave it to the Chicago Fire soccer team, for instance, as training grounds, because it's a huge vacant tract to the south of the Jane Addams homes. With the gentrification, there's a sushi place across the street. I mean, we're already there. And there are plenty of neighbors who want the thing gone, white neighbors walking their dogs and want it gone. Yeah, I agree that that may be how do we turn that into part of the conversation will be an important question. We've already run programs that, anti-gentrification programs. There will be pushback, but I think with a strong vision and commitment, we can hold our own. So yeah, there's no doubt that the area is completely gentrifying.
Thank you all.
That one more thing,
Go ahead.
sorry, that library across the street is a CHA, Chicago Public Housing, Public Library Partnership. There's a library on the first floor and above it are senior housing. And that was an innovative partnership between the two. And we think that's great. And it's more public writ large. And so we were happy that that went in actually.
Good, thank you. And thank you all for giving voice to the questions in the chat. I'm going to turn to Meg. Do you want to unmute? You asked a question that I had in my mind.
Sure. First off, thank you so much for this presentation and for everyone's conversation and contributions. I'm in St. Louis, and so here our most famous kind of housing project policy failure, but also, as you mentioned, story of resilience and joy and this moment of great potential is Pruitt-Igoe. And so I'm wondering, that's kind of where my question is coming from, but I'm wondering how the museum is looking to, reach out to that broader national community, because this is the only national, the only one in the US. So how do you guys foresee that happening, maintaining the balance between being in Chicago for Chicago in a space, but also everywhere needs this. And if you want to open up a branch in St. Louis, I'm very down for that. But until that money comes in, that's my question.
So we've started to partner with places to think about, like, can the National Public Housing Museum partner with a local organization to do a temporary exhibit, some space? We traveled with some of our stuff to Los Angeles at one point. I think this is a major question for the museum. We've added more board members who are national. Can we have space in the new museum for temporary exhibits? Can those be national, international? I still think we could do, what's going on in Singapore, what's going on in Sweden, Africa, all these other places, how have they dealt with this housing as a human right problem? But I think you're right. In order to be a truly national museum, we've got to connect more strongly with activists on the ground in these cities, places like St. Louis, tell the Pruitt-Igoe story, give a framework, bring our framework to the table, not dictate it, and say, here's how we've approached this. Maybe you want to, is it a branch? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have a good answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I wonder too, Brad, whether there's this, do you set aside a portion of the museum, some of the rooms that are permanently dedicated to the non-Chicago story? Probably have to come up with a better label for it than that.
Yeah.
But the national feel, I don't know if that's in the works, or
the permanent exhibit will have national stories. Absolutely. Okay. We will tell the Pruitt-Igoe story. I don't know how in depth, but we will reference national spaces in what we're calling the permanent exhibit that tells the whole story. I think there's still, even in that national story, it's still a little too Chicago centric. And we have an advisory group of scholars that is pushing, like, hey, Oakland and, Nebraska, and there are places all around the country that have done public housing in interesting ways. The New Orleans story needs to be told. St. Louis story is vital to the national narrative around public housing failure. The New York story is very different. New York is largely successful. Now they're running out of money in the last few years, and they've got a capital problem, a renovation problem. But, very different outcomes across the country. And why is that? What's going on? We want to make sure people understand the diversity of public housing across the country as built environment, but also the diversity of the human experience and, you know, off-center the standard narratives of racialized poverty and failure.
Thanks. Back to you, Meg. I think.
Sorry, Meg, I'm sorry if I cut you off, sorry.
No, I have a different question. So earlier, I think you mentioned, you did mention the artist residency, I believe, or fellowship. And I'm wondering if there are other programs that the museum is considering, because especially, I mean, what intrigues me about this space is that it's not just rethinking, you know, public housing, which has largely been misunderstood, but it's also rethinking the role of, as you mentioned, the museum. And it seems like a wonderful space to have a Nebraska fellow come for a year and do the work and have a temporary exhibition and take it home, and is able to, you know, bring that back to, because everything is local, you know, and the local space matters. I'm wondering if there are plans for other kinds of fellowships other than just the artist one, which I love. I'm an artist.
Fantastic
I love
idea.
that.
Yeah, we call it artist as instigator. Again, that active social justice front foot forward. Yeah, no, that's a great idea to bring, you know, I think our next one is from Baltimore. So it's not, the person is not from Chicago. So we are thinking of this as a national program. It'd be great to have 10 of these people and bring them in and go, you know, travel around and have them interact, you know, like if we could afford it, or even if it meant just a few weekends of them interacting. Gosh, that's a great idea. But we don't have that plan. We're now just breaking ground. And yeah, but Lisa Lee would love that. And you know, a lot of this is inspired by her art. But she, you know, the interesting thing about Lisa Lee, she has a PhD in German studies and wrote a book on the philosophy of Theodor Adorno. I couldn't tell you the first thing about Adorno, you know, but took that humanist background and has just run with it in museum studies in really interesting and creative ways. Yeah, I would point you, Meg, to things that she's written. And if you ever can see a Zoom of her work in action, it's charisma. Now that's a problem. Charismatic leader. Eventually, Lisa Lee's been doing this 10 years or whatever. She may say, I'm moving on. Who's going to be our next fearless leader, and who's going to take this on? That's going to be a real challenge of leadership succession, because we have been somewhat dependent on our board chair, Sonny Fisher, Lisa Lee, and the handful of residents who have really celebrated and led this project. Yeah, there are a couple articles that have been written. There's one by an anthropologist that's very anthropological, but quite interesting on the process and the message of the museum. Catherine Fennell at Columbia University is the anthropologist, Fennell. And the title of that one is, I reread that, something of, I can't even read it, something of resilience, raising a sympathetic, it's in the Journal of Cultural Anthropology. It's, but Lisa Lee wrote a piece that I always recommend titled, Preserving Difficult Histories. And that's something we talk about in public history all the time, like preserving difficult history. This is history that many people don't want to talk about, that's sometimes hard to talk about. There is violence, there is racism, there is a lot of negative happening in public housing communities. We got to talk about it. We can't shove it under the rug. We got to bring it to the fore, but also think about it from multiple dimensions and tell the stories in the forms of resilience as well. Sorry.
You know, one of the things that it strikes me, I agree with the you know, some public history articles and opportunity for students in the public history program and other scholars around the world from other departments. It also seems like this is something that really plays well or could play well to the multimedia virtual sort of space of which also I think would help you with thinking through or making connections beyond Chicago stories. You know, maybe it's because I'm the father of a young filmmaker, but immediately as you were telling this story, I was thinking, wow, this is something, this is going to go on a screen well, right? I mean, kind of not just both the stories that you're collecting, but also the story of the museum and the reason for the museum. So
Yeah.
interesting.
In some ways, the walls are less and less important these days. And the content that you produce digitally and the programming you do that connects humans to humans, I think that's been a lesson for me. The walls, you know, are not insignificant, but having a place, but having a community, a gathering space is as important.
Definitely an opportunity for the both and, because you do have a physical space and there's an importance there that we talked about, but then also being able to use some of the technology. And I know you have colleagues in the department, but thinking about that kind of blowing it up a bit.
New documentaries, new podcasts, new vision, new interactive database websites, new digital tools for helping people understand the broader public. There's so much work to do. It's just staggering.
Yeah. Other questions, comments from the group? Feel free to just unmute yourself there.
Comments are great. Can we save those too, David?
Yep. Yep.
Thanks to Tim Lacey for being here, and and Maggie, thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, thank you, David, and thanks to Curl for having me, and Meredith for making this happen. I love this topic. Happy to talk more about it. Love the museum. Got to get more Loyola students involved. We took a tour last spring with some graduate students, internships. There's just opportunity just lying on the surface, and I've got to get more people connected. So,
well, thank you so much. This was fascinating and again, brilliantly timed on our part. But no, really, it was a fascinating presentation and a conversation. And speaking on behalf of Curl, not only thank you for presenting, but let us know how we can be helpful in this. I don't have any brilliant ideas off the top of my head. I haven't had enough coffee quite yet, but we're happy to, as we like to say, dream some dreams. We love half-baked ideas and harebrained schemes. So do let us know, because you've got something really, really good here, and we would love to be able to play a small part in furthering it along. So thank you for coming today, and thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you all next week.
thanks, Ted. All right.